Welcome, everybody, to the Sacramental Charismatic. I am your host, Luke Garrity, and we are in Season 2. We are in Episode 13 today, and just excited about having a conversation with a good friend of mine today. Before we do that, though, I just wanted to mention that, again, this podcast is oftentimes a conversation that's kind of focused around the intersection of ecclesiology and pneumatology and missiology and sacramentality. But as I said in the first season, I also get to talk about whatever I want because I am the one who's paying for the hosting. So I feel like that is a legitimate option. But anyway, I'm really excited about this season. I have a bunch of really great guests coming up in the next couple of weeks, next couple of episodes. I'm actually going to have a bunch of different Anglican theologians and pastors, priests on, and they're going to be talking about, I guess, their perspective on sacramental theology. A number of them are charismatic in their orientation as well. In fact, I'm going to have a bishop, an Anglican bishop on. So just going to really enjoy that conversation, and we can figure out what those Episcopalian folks are up to in the sacramental charismatic world. But today on this episode, I am pleased to have a good friend of mine who I have been a huge fan of his work and have followed him on Twitter, and I like to troll him on Twitter. That's actually probably my favorite thing to do. But I am super happy to have Dr. Ben Blackwell. Doctor, welcome.
Yeah. Hey, it's great to be here. So it's I'm a longtime listener, first time caller guy here. So it's good to actually be on and participate, not just lurk myself. So
yeah, that's kind of like a good way to describe our relationship. Is like we're always working on each other's work and, and interacting, And actually, Ben, so you and I met. I want to say it was probably 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I think it was 4. I can't remember. I actually came down with this crazy brain condition literally about 2 weeks after I went to the SVS that we met at. So,
oh no, that might have been.
The weird thing about it. Yeah. Anyhow, it fortunately did no more than give me cause to use reading glasses now. So that's all over. But anyhow, I was riding back with Bert Wagner. It was at Yale, and he and I are at different airports, and so we made it back to his flight, but I ended up missing mine because of New York traffic. And anyhow, spent the night at JFK on the floor for a part of the time, and so that's how I remember that whole experience.
Yeah. No, that was good. And I think we actually did get introduced because of my friend Thomas Lyons, who I think is a friend of yours, and he's a newly minted PhD from Asbury.
Yeah.
Biblical studies. So, but yeah, and so we've been, kind of, I guess, long distance friends. You are in Houston, and you are a professor in Houston at a seminary / university there, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I direct Houston Theological Seminary, which is just our graduate theological programs at Houston Baptist University. So it's a good place. It's a multi-denominational seminary. So in that sense, it's not limited to Baptists. Hence why I'm there. I'm kosher as a Vineyard person there, but a lot of random folk, different traditions. So it's a good place to land.
Yeah. And so I have been really excited about having you on the podcast because the last semester or course or whatever, I've been teaching a course for a university in New Zealand, Vineyard College, which is I guess it's just an undergrad school that is for pastors and lay leaders who are wanting to become, better theologians and better, at understanding the Bible. And so when I was putting together my course, which is a kind of an introduction to theology, I was looking for a textbook, and I skirted a little bit around Michael Bird's evangelical theology because it's got comedic parts of it and comedy all over it, and I love his work. But it was, a little too much, I think, for probably most undergrads. And so I was fortunate enough to get a copy of this book right here, which is called Engaging Theology, which you are a co-author on. And the subtitle is A Biblical, Historical, and Practical Introduction. And so I am just at the end of teaching this course, and I've used this book alongside Michael Bird's shorter book, What Christians Ought to Believe, kind of as a secondary reading. And I just got to tell you, the book has been fantastic to work through, and providing lectures, kind of springboarding off of your work. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about that. I'd love to kind of like maybe dive into that. Like what caused you to write this book, or to think that this would be a helpful book? Because there's obviously a lot of books on theology out there, some accessible, some not accessible. How did it come about? And then who's your target audience?
Yeah. That's well, the whole reason that we were able to write this book is because Mike Bird only had a really short one and a really long one, and so Zondervan still needed somewhere in between, and so we barely snuck in before
he missed his opportunity.
Because I'm sure he's got a medium-sized version on the way.
Yeah.
But in that sense, we teach an intro to theology class here that we use across campus, so at HBU. And so a lot of evangelical schools have an intro to Old and New Testament as their two kind of theology classes or Bible classes. And so we have an intro to the Bible and intro to theology. And
great.
One of the things that is unique about our setting is that HBU is the most ethnically diverse Protestant campus in the U.S. So what that means then is we don't have all Baptist students by any means. In fact, we have a good number of students that are active participants of other faith traditions like Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist kind of things. And so not only are we doing Catholic Protestant discussions, we're doing Christian and other faith traditions. And so one of the things that really struck us is that we needed to write a theology that was better at not just for insiders. So people that had been raised in the church and knew the Bible really well. And so this was just going to be the capstone of what they already knew. It turns out that, for our setting, that just wasn't a good fit. And the other thing that came with that, though, is that it turns out it's not that just the non-Christians that don't know the Bible anymore. More and more evangelicals just don't come from Bible teaching traditions. And so in that sense, so many high school students that have been raised all their lives in Christian settings just don't know the Bible that well. And so for us then, as we're teaching theology, we wanted to do a theology book that had a really strong biblical foundation that led into the story of theology, but also helped bring together some of those conversations and help and so the onboarding for Christians and non-Christians seemed actually to work in a lot the same way.
Wow. So that kind of that course essentially caused you to kind of move into the realm of writing a book that would be perfect for the textbook, and then also kind of would it be accurate to assume that the book is really kind of outworking of what you discovered in the midst of doing all these courses with different students, that you found out there were a lot of questions being asked that a lot of systematic theologies kind of ignore or just don't even talk about?
Yeah, so the original proposed title that when I came up with the book in the first place was Orthodoxy, Who Cares? And in this sense, as I was teaching theology, so not just to that intro to gen ed population, but also to ministry majors. And, I did patristic theology and New Testament as my PhD. And so I geek out on Christological controversies and the councils and all that kind of stuff. And as I would teach Trinitarianism or the hypostatic union and all these kind of things, it became clear to me that the evangelical students or others were just you could just as well argue that Jesus needed 6 fingers to save us as he had to be kind of a divine and human. It's just some theological proposition that's disconnected from reality. So it doesn't fit with kind of the story of the Bible. It doesn't seem to fit with their practical, relevant experience. And so one of the things that kind of drove us, right, and that's why orthodoxy, who cares? It's it's just a bunch of set of ideas. And for us then, as we wanted to communicate this, it was without being drawn into like pragmatism and just in that sense, but we really wanted to show, well, how is theology relevant so that it connects to the Bible, it connects to the history of the church, and it connects to the practicalities of life. And so hence, the way that we approached it. And so that it is one of the things I think that when you read systematic theology, a lot of times they reference the Bible, but they don't really engage the narrative of the Bible in that sense. And then also on the back end, the funny thing is, to me, it's like you don't really get that much practical stuff. It's supposed to be communicating kind of biblical truth to contemporary setting, but it usually just stays in the world of ideas. And so one of the main things that was driving us in this is that, no, theology comes out of the church. We've separated it from the church, and so from the life, the spiritual life. And so it was important to us that, 15 or 20% of every chapter has real connection to the practice of theology, the formation.
Yeah, I think that's, just as I've got a copy, I want to let you know, I bought it on my Logos account, and I also have a hard copy. So that's how Christian I am. But when you're looking at some of your chapters here, it really is a great introduction to like your general theological questions. But you start with theological method, which as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, I'm in. This is a great textbook. But you have these chapters. I'm just going to use the Trinity as an example. So you start out with like your basic introduction, and then you have the kind of the history of the development of the doctrine of the Trinity, as well as some of the questions and controversies that came up. But what I really love about it is what you just were talking about, the practical aspect of it, because you have a whole thing about the contemporary issues, and then you have a section on like how other different traditions, both maybe what I call heterodox Christianity, like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, and then, different religions altogether, like Islam or Hinduism, and how these truths, I guess, are thought of in those. And I thought that was really helpful. And I have found it's like easy to have conversations around some of those topics with people outside of the Christian faith because of the way that you've written. Like I've actually used some of those as on-ramps to talk to people who are like Hindu, for example, and so was that like requested by the publisher, or is that again just the outworking of teaching students who are all over the map?
Yeah, I think it was just being here in Houston. Part of it was living, I lived in Durham, England for a couple 5 years, and so had that experience of like encountering Christianity that was wider than just my evangelical bubble. And, and in seminary, I was really, blessed by kind of, even though I went to DTS, which I know you're a little skeptical about dispensational theology.
Do you like how I always throw shade on dispensation every time I can? I know, I'm sorry. I apologize.
I'm not dispensational anymore, but was introduced to Catholic theology and Eastern Orthodox theology there. And so when I went to Durham, I had the great pleasure to work with N.T. Wright for a couple of years. And so one of the main things that was really of interest to me in that was his daily commitment to prayer. And so using an updated version of the Book of Common Prayer called Daily Worship or Common Worship. And so I would go out. I would always schedule my meetings in the morning, because he would invite me to come and do the prayer service with him and his chaplain beforehand. And so I was informed in this way of life and theology wider than my own. And in that sense, though, it's like I'd been exposed to this greater circle of Christian theology, but then I come to Houston and 25% of the working population here are foreign born. So that means somewhere outside the U.S., right? Of course, a lot from Latin America, but Nigeria, the Middle East, China, India, Pakistan. I mean, you get everybody here. And of course, our student population reflects that as well. And so had these experiences with Muslim students or Mormon students or whoever. And so it was like, gosh, I'm inadequate to have even a basic conversation there. And so the goal here was to at least provide in a lot of ways a dispassionate, so sometimes I'm just going to throw stones at those other people. Particularly Mormonism is a good example here. Mm-hmm. Of course, I don't agree with so much Mormonism, but there are other things that are just kind of bog standard Christian stuff that they're exactly the same as kind of other evangelical Christians.
Yeah, it almost seems like it's hard to find critique on some things because it's like, they kind of agree the same thing we do.
Yeah, I mean, penal substitution, they're pretty down the line with penal substitution, and of course, different people have different positions.
Every Calvinist is like, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so it's like, can you have like I said, dispassionate to where you say like, actually they get some things right, but then here are other things that are fundamentally different without it being name calling or just ad hominem kind of stuff. And the same thing with other religions too. And part of that, it helps when that people of these traditions are going to read this, it's not just insiders reading it. And that's why you can sometimes get away with the name calling kind of stuff. And so it forced us to be as accurate as we could. And we're not experts on all these other traditions either. So I'm sure we probably get many things wrong or, in that sense. And there's so much diversity in Islam or, tradition that we don't get. But, at least in some place, just as a conversation starter, where are just some of these basic similarities and differences?
How did you do that? How did you, I guess when it comes to writing these chapters, these sections of the chapters, interacting with other faith traditions and not being specialists in global religions or, world religions, was that just you read books or did you actually have conversations with different people who are in that camp?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So I've taught world religions here, and so have done.
Oh, so you are an expert. Okay, my bad. I didn't realize you are an expert.
Oh, well, no. I'm the furthest thing from an expert.
I'm just kidding.
At least, as you go to write, you're like, oh gosh, well, I realized what I'd been teaching in that class was not that accurate. Because again, it forces you to that extra level of detail. Randy Hackett, who I teach with, is much better on world Christianity than I am as well too, and so that helps balance out. But then, like I said, I've had a Mormon student that I've had a really good relationship with. In fact, he and his church invited me to come talk to a group, about the similarities and differences of kind of Orthodox Christianity and Mormonism, and those interchanges that helped refine and lead me through. And so, of course, so it's a little bit of all of the above.
Wow. So you were actually able to go and have some interaction. I found that, so I grew up probably, was it Martin something, Kingdom of Cults? That was our guy, right? That was our guy. And and so there's a lot of things in it that I found fascinating. It's kind of overwhelming because it's just really footnotes of random things that are wrong with everybody. But I remember I was on a plane one time, and I am the kind of guy that when I sit down, and this is actually how I know I'm not an evangelist. I sit on a plane, and I'm like praying that no one will sit by me, and I put my headphones around my nose, and I sat down, and I was sitting there and this guy sat down and, just like, even with my headphones on, started trying to talk to me. And I, obviously was, I am a Christian. So I took him out, started talking a little bit. And it became really clear that he was definitely trying to evangelize me. And I had this suspicion that he was probably a Mormon. And I think it might've been because we were flying out of Salt Lake City, but,
okay.
But after we started talking, we actually had this really great conversation and he found out I was a pastor, and we had, we talked about the Bible a bit. And it was interesting because on one hand, he was just really happy to know that I had faith and that I believed in Jesus. And he said something along the lines of, well, the important thing, even though we have some differences in our denominations, and that was an interesting concept because some people would say, well, you're not a denomination, you're a cult. And I definitely have some concerns about some of the theology, but he said, the important thing is that we both believe that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. And when he said that, I was like, that's a little bit different than what I was always told that they believe, and I think that I know that there's been a host of evangelical scholars that have been having meetings at BYU with their their theologians, and I know that there's been a lot of ecumenical dialogue, which would be fascinating to know more about. But I think that's like what you're talking about, having conversations seems really healthy and really helpful to not only understand where they're coming from, but for us to understand where we're at. And that's what I really love about your book.
Yeah, I think that's the whole thing is like you can so easily feel like you're arguing with other Christians. So like when I remember when I was go off to college, I went back to visit my hometown high school and bumped into this friend that I didn't remember being a Christian or not or whatever, but we got to talking. Turns out he's Church of Christ.
Oh, okay.
Of course, we had this big,
yeah. My mom became a Christian in a Church of Christ, and that was my first church experience.
Okay. So, but of course, this is after I had gone off and gotten a Baptist undergraduate degree in religion. And so what did we do? We had this argument about, can you lose your salvation, and two things there, right? You begin to major on the minors. I think is what happens when you only have insider conversations. And so when you put it in the wider context, it's like some of the things that seem like, why in the world would Christians believe this? It's like when you see the world universe of other religions or other what we call Christian related traditions like Mormonism, you realize it's like, okay, now this makes sense why we would hold this position. And so having that external view helps there. But then also in that sense of one of the things that drives the book is this coming back to the Nicene Creed as what unifies all Christians. So whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, we have this common faith tradition that unites all of us. So in that same way, it goes beyond just Jesus dying on the cross. But at the same time, that there is some coherent narrative to Christian theology, but even that it comes straight out of the Bible. And so when we talk about theology or the Nicene Creed, it's not some made up thing that showed up 300 years later. It's out of the baptismal confession that arose very early, called the Rule of Faith. But it's basically the spark notes of the Bible, right? That God who created the world, Jesus comes to save us. And we have this hope for the future because the Spirit is the one who will bring life and resurrection. And so, it helps. It just grounds people in the big picture instead of getting lost in these details of why are we fighting about these other issues. And it's not that they're unimportant. We actually have a whole section of the book about these debates between traditions. Yeah. But we make sure those are secondary and that we focus on the big picture, the unifying aspects first before we get to the debates.
Yeah, and that's what I've loved about your book, because I've tried to. I think I have these like competing maybe philosophies or values of ministry and teaching, but it's like I really want people to understand that there's a lot of different perspectives out there. Like when it comes to eschatology, there's two really that matter in my world: historic premillennials,
the right one and the wrong one.
Yeah, no. I'm okay with those two, but at the same time too, like I want people to understand that there's a variety of different perspectives on eschatology. When it comes to needing to, I guess, wanting people to, I the philosophy I have is that I want people to understand there's a lot of different perspectives out there, but at the same time too that there is a centrality. It's like I always use the primary, and then there's secondary, and then there's like third level. So there's some things that you're going to die for, and then there's certain things that you wouldn't take a paper cut for. I don't care. But when it comes to the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, so obviously the Apostles' Creed is pretty general. I mean, it might be mere Christianity, but in your understanding, like would Mormons be able to affirm the Apostles' Creed?
I think the Apostles' Creed probably even more so. Even the Nicene Creed, this came up when we were meeting with, talking with when I went to that Mormon church and was talking with their leaders there. The big difference is not, it has to do with the homoousios language, the same nature. And in that sense, actually, I think they were comfortable affirming the Nicene Creed. What's implied in the Nicene Creed is that when Christ is of the same nature as the Father, right? He's, although I guess they may not, I don't know, the begotten created language. The deal is when we say that the Son is of the same nature of the Father, we're implicitly saying that they are of a different nature than humanity. human nature is different than divine nature.
Yeah.
And of course, with Mormonism, God the Father, we are literally the spirit children of Heavenly Father. And so in that sense, we have the exact same nature as the Father and the Son. And so that's where so much of Mormonism is different. It's not so much on the arc of kind of the economy of salvation. It's on the kind of the bookends of history, to where we, one way or the other.
It's like the anthropology and the eschatology where they kind of meet, which you actually have written a dissertation on, right? I mean, that's
the whole idea of deification or theosis, and this is where Mormonism would be different, right? Orthodox Christology or theology, theosis, is always, when it says that we become gods, like Athanasius used that, or Cyril of Alexandria. I mean, all the Eastern Orthodox Greek fathers use that language. They're always using it as a metaphor. We become like God because God's nature is so different, so other than us. So even like Gregory of Nyssa says, even in the afterlife, when we, become perfect, we're always going to be growing because we're finite. Only God is infinite. And so we can never become God in that sense. Whereas in Mormonism, literally, we share the same nature already. The only difference is that God, Heavenly Father, and the Jesus are just more advanced in their spirituality and sanctification than we are. And so as we progress in that sanctification to be like them, we would have the same kind of power and authority that they have.
Gotcha. So that's kind of like was probably pretty helpful then to have some of that in your back pocket. I actually wrote a PhD on the subject we're talking about. So that's
So that's so I was ignorant of Mormonism until of late. But I mean, a lot of these questions show up in so many different traditions about what's the nature of God, what's the nature of humanity, and how do these two interact? I mean, that's the basis of religion, So
and I think probably even more so right now. But there are virtually thousands of pastors all over the U.S. right now who are wondering if the people that are in their churches are even Christians, and some based off of theology, right? I mean, I'm surprised at how many times you read these polls, and I'm not a huge fan of some polls because I did enough studying on empirical data and statistics and research. Polls are destined to fail in the beginning, but when you hear some of the stats about what Christians, quote unquote evangelical Christians believe, it just doesn't fit with even basic apostolic Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. It's pretty concerning. You're talking about well, this is one thing that some of my students actually really appreciated about the course that I've been doing is how they've and I had to say, well, I think it's a lot based off of because of your guys' book, but they've seen is there's a coherence and a consistency and how all these different theological topics like intermingle. Because I'm on the two sessions I'm on right now, the last two parts of this course, I'm on eschatology and how eschatology, connects to sanctification and salvation in general. And it's also connected to the kingdom theology, right? It's kind of interesting because we're really talking more about the kingdom, which I would have wanted to do back in session 1 and 2, but we have to kind of wait until sessions 19 and 20 because, it's like, all of the eschatology stuff really is best unpacked sometimes when we think about the presence of the future and the now and the not yet and all that type of stuff. So how do you think, how have you made sure to adequately have consistency across the map and to interweave these things? Is that because of your own values or, because it seems to be like there's a philosophical commitment to having some consistency in argument, and what would you say to the folks who are now leaning more into a postmodernity, kind of that narrative? And I'm really, I don't want to sound like I'm throwing shade, just, more of a narrative approach or maybe that's a Western Renaissance, type of way of looking at the world, and we need to get rid of that because I think you and I both being in Vineyards, we would lean into probably a both and rather than an either or in a lot of different areas.
Yeah. So I think
talk about
as a short, like to help describe the book, maybe for people, is that I often say it's the Bible Project meets systematic theology, in the sense that we believe there's one coherent story that holds together the whole Bible. And of course, they say it leads to Jesus. And, I would say, Trinitarian, Jesus as represents God's work in the world through the Spirit as well. But in that sense, it's trying to grasp that core central message, because I think if you get that central story that overgirds or unites the biblical narrative, it gives some coherence there. And so in that sense, we were talking earlier about the nature of theology and primary and secondary. And one of the things that I think is a little bit more in that is kind of the centered set versus the bounded set kind of model of theology. And so it is, we have a kind of a postmodern approach in that sense, because it is more centered set. Like, we're going to agree about the Trinity is necessary, whereas your view of the millennial kingdom is not as important, although there is one right.
Do all your DTS professors know right now that you just said that? Because that's questionable. If you're
probably one of my most influential professors got fired for making too many people reformed in their eschatology. So he is outside of that fold now. So that's probably without, probably why I strayed as far as I did. But
that's funny.
But in that sense, it's a centered set so there are some things. So it's not fully postmodern, because it's like there are some things that we're going to go to the mat over. In fact, these are the things that we think all Christians should go to the bat over, because these are what Christians have affirmed as the primary issues. But then also that willingness to say, hey, there's good reason why people baptize infants and others only baptize adults, and so it's not like this is unrelated, but it fits in that story. And so one of the things you're talking about, the coherence of it all, is I do think, like, once I started working for Tom Wright, but even a step further, and took that kind of coherent model, the coherence or unified story model that Wright works with, and then link that with charismatic theology, it, like, everything fits, because even Wright's model is great, but so much of the exorcisms and the healings and all that kind of stuff are affirmed. I mean, it's not, he's going to deny that, but it doesn't have that kind of, it doesn't make sense of like what it seems to be so central to Jesus' ministry. And it's like, if you can't really incorporate what Jesus says is central to his ministry in a visceral way, not just an academic, I affirm that it happened way. It's like, once you buy that, then the whole thing seems to take on even a stronger coherence.
I think that's true. I know that in certain circles, like, N.T. Wright is either the guy that everybody loves or the guy that, I think you have to at least, you can't be too critical of. And obviously, you know what I mean? People that don't like anything, because he's just such a great scholar. But it's interesting. My observation, and I love N.T. Wright, in a lot of different areas, but it seems like his high Anglicanism sometimes gets in the way of the exegesis, and then not only the exegesis, but the application of what that text actually means for us today. And I think that's true about all the charismatic stuff, because, man, it sure seems like Jesus, especially in the Luke's, I think in Luke and anything, right? Whether it's Luke or Acts, it seems like the power stuff, the pneumatological power encounter, signs and wonders part seems to be like a pretty big thing for Luke. Like, he's not just, it's like all over the place, but it just doesn't fit into our world. And that's why I think this is where I'd be curious, someday, if I ever had the opportunity to talk to it, it'd be interesting to hear about, like, the sacramental tradition. What I'm gathering is that charismatic theology is the perfect on-ramp into the sacramental world, because I think most of the time charismatics are very okay with the idea of mystery in some sense. We've also bought into a lot of the modernities, like need for empirical certainty and whatnot, but we have a grid for that, like the, meeting with the transcendent and having this divine mysterious connection, in worship or whatever. But it seems like the sacramental stuff, which would be influential in some of Wright's, ecclesiology and theology in general, might actually, if he was more sacramental, perhaps would lead into being able to account for and even think about the practical application of the charismatic stuff, which, again, I'm sure he's aware of all the Anglican charismatic folks and New Wine and all that stuff too. But it's interesting that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in that sense, like this is so I had a charismatic experience back when I was in high school. My best friend was Pentecostal. And so that's when I first spoke in tongues and really kind of embraced that as a theological position, but stayed within the Baptist world. And so never really, it wasn't a regular practice. It was kind of a personal practice rather than my communal ecclesial practice. But one of the things that struck, and so it wasn't until about 10 years ago when I moved to Houston that I joined the Vineyard. And by that time I was a little bit more open and I guess, less insecure about where I'm going to land a job and all that kind of stuff. Cause we're the Vineyard colleges, right? There's nowhere to
New Zealand, evidently.
That's right. That is. I do teach with Westminster Theological Center in the UK, and they always have a good stream of Vineyard folks that come through there. It's a charismatic. It's a really robust and holistic place. HBU, I think probably hired me in spite of my theology there rather than because of it. But they let me go. So we're big tent evangelicals there. So we got charismatic. Reformed and Arminian and Wesleyan and all sorts of stripes there. But all that's to say is what I learned or felt as I went into patristic theology, you have this whole idea that the material world can inhabit, spiritual realities inhabit this material world. And of course, in patristic theology, that's like through the cult of saints and, you've got holy objects and things like that. But as I started to move more in the charismatic world, personally, it's like, gosh, there's so much of a similar mode. It's just with a different object. So you've got anointing oil or the prayer cloth or whatever, rather than, these holy objects that you have in more sacramental. And so it is where I did begin to see that whole bridge between there. That sometimes they look like you've got high church and charismatic is the lowest of the low church. And so they're going to be the furthest away, but it's more of a triangle to where you've got the evangelical and the charismatic and then the sacramental. And so there are connections on the sacramental charismatic side that don't have to be bridged through that evangelical world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen Pentecostal churches be really super anything that remotely sounds like it's sacramental or liturgical, like icons or, there's crosses and things like that. But then they'll have, they'll have anointing oil right there, or they'll definitely be all about, the communion and, or even the idea of having prayer shawls to throw on people who have passed out. It's like there's all these material matters that they have a value for, but if it sounds too much like it's quote unquote Catholic or I guess sacramental, then it's like no. But I think that's been my experience, is that the more that we start to ask questions about maybe our biases and our theological biases that are preventing us from seeing other traditions as having something to bring to the table, the worse we are. We're worse off for that, because I think there's a lot of things that in our tradition in the Vineyard, I think we've been benefited quite a bit from liturgical and spiritual formative streams. I think, the sacramental, liturgical, spiritual formation world, because that has been, I think, a huge, we've been anemic in those areas, not just the Vineyard, but I think evangelical charismatic churches in general, we've not been very good at that. I'm going to someday figure out how I can talk about Dallas Willard without sounding like a anti-Dallas Willard guy, because I love Dallas Willard. I do, and we might have talked about this before, but I love Dallas Willard's stuff. But it's ironic to me that there's so many people who love Dallas Willard's stuff who don't do any of it. Or it's like they're not engaged in mission, and they're really like the commitment to local church. It's like no different than people who have gone to parachurch ministries who then become so jaded. They're like, as a pastor, you're like, please don't come to my church. Like please anywhere else, and
yeah.
So I just feel like the reason why is I think that, and again, it's not Dallas Willard, it's just people who maybe latch on to that emphasis, like that when you think about the knowing, being, and doing, if you don't really prioritize all three of those components of human ontology, or I don't even know how to talk about that, but if you don't really press into all three, it's really easy to become a Pharisee, or to be, unengaged, or to not have a valid, life-giving relationship with Jesus. That's sustaining. So I think that's probably why the charismatic sacramental thing has been such of an interest to me. Is trying to like balance myself out a little bit.
Yeah, and I got exposed, particularly through, well, I guess once I got here to Houston, to one of International House of Prayer kind of folks, and particularly their movement towards a local group called Exodus, not Exodus Cry, that's the old one. Elijah Rising is the name of it now. But it's a human trafficking ministry. And so just the whole idea, the connection between prayer and praise and worship, that we really believe that it's not against flesh and blood that's driving this, but these are spiritual powers. And so that link between charismatic theology and like new monastic kind of stuff. And so the 24/7 prayer movement, I've gotten to know better through the Westminster Theological Seminary.
Peter Gregg and those folks. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it has a lot of similar things with IHOP, but in that sense of like that there is this link to this some monastic spirituality that charismatics can inhabit in a unique way, and just a very interesting bridges there that I never anticipated maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And so it's
wow. Yeah, it is kind of interesting how the more, I mean, I guess it's the more you study, but also the more that you engage with other people, other different traditions, you realize that, hey, maybe there's something, to be learned here, or something valid. So let's kind of, I'd love to dive into a little bit more of your time with N.T. Wright, because when I found out, I think it was probably the last time we were talking, it was like you were a research assistant, or you did something for N.T. Wright, which, most evangelicals in the U.S. that are probably under the age of 45 are like, frothing at the mouth to know, what's he like and things like that. But, I mean, how did you get into, working with N.T. Wright, and what did you do over the course of that? And then, maybe if you could, what's something that you really valued for your time from N.T. Wright?
Yeah, that's great. It's my whole academic experience is very Forrest Gump, which is kind of funny because my WTC students, they're all British. They don't know the different American accents well, but they do know that I talk slowly, and so my nickname there is Forrest Gump. So, but I've had the Forrest Gump experience. So, there are a variety of ways that got me there. Once I started going the academic track, because my wife and I were looking at doing missions in France, and for a series of reasons, we decided to step back. And anyhow, a couple of years later, it's like, okay, we're going to go do a PhD. Didn't study New Testament, didn't focus on New Testament, so I didn't know kind of a lot of the New Testament debates. So friends of mine encouraged me to study with John Barclay, who I'd never heard of. And it turns out he's written after I graduated, written one of the most influential books in New Testament over the past 50 years, his Paul and the Jeff.
Yeah, he's like the guy.
So like he's the guy. So I didn't even know him from Adam, but friends of mine were like, hey, you should study with him. So I'm like, okay, I don't know whether he's good, bad, or whatever. I mean, of course, they told me to study because he's good. So I'm just going to trust you. I hadn't read anything of his. And so to end up studying with him was, phenomenal, right? Forrest Gump, step number one. Well, so I get to Durham, and there's this whole movement in Pauline studies called the New Perspective on Paul. So it was the new perspective back in 1980, right? It's not new anymore, but
when EP Sanders was cutting edge, all
that kind of stuff. Well, guess what? I went there in 2006 or whatever, it was like it had never even happened. I don't know how I got out of seminary. This is one of the few things at DTS I was just like deficient on. I'd never even heard of the New Perspective.
Wow.
And I went to the kind of center because Jimmy Dunn was teaching there. N.T. Wright was the bishop of Durham. And so it's like going to Rome and not knowing the Catholic Church exists. You know?
We're going to come back to this. So I'm just out of curiosity, because I do have to ask this question about Dallas Theological Seminary. Just in understanding dispensationalism a little bit.
Yep.
So I have been pretty familiar with the New Perspective because of being in the Reformed world. Being at Reformed seminaries and then listening to Reformed thinkers. That was like that's like all we talked about in the early 2000s.
Oh, yeah.
John Piper wrote a book about N.T. Wright without having ever read N.T. Wright or actually engaged N.T. Wright. That's mean. But it's probably true based off of my reading of his book. Why do you think dispensationalism, and I know that DTS is really more progressive dispensational now, and so I can't really say. I know that they don't hand out Schofield Bibles at the door. I'll admit that. But why do you think that the progressive dispensational world was like maybe slower to engage it, or maybe just not interested in that?
Yeah, so part of it was I studied more historical theology at DTS, the New Testament. So I have no doubt, because I know Darrell Box there, and I have a friend of mine actually from DTS that ended up at Durham studying ancient Second Temple Judaism and all this kind of stuff. So part of it is who you ended up studying, happened to have in the mix.
Gotcha.
But the who I did have tended to focus more on the Greco-Roman background of Christianity rather than Second Temple Jewish stuff. So, for shameless plug here, this is what helped build this series of books. So reading Romans in context, reading Mark in context, reading Revelation in context, that I've helped edit, because I was just ignorant that whole world existed. And so a couple of friends of mine and I helped edit this series to help introduce, people to this world.
Gotcha.
And so all the chapters, we were like, look, they got to be short chapters, no chapters longer than 6 or 7 pages long, because we want people that are non-specialists to be able to appreciate, not only what these texts are, but also how they help us understand the Bible better.
Great.
Of course, the whole New Perspective is the idea of Second Temple Judaism. So Judaism, after that Second Temple was rebuilt after the exile, then when it was destroyed in AD 70. And so, of course, that's when Christianity arose out of this time period. So, and N.T. Wright is, huge into Second Temple Judaism.
Yeah, he's the guy. He's the living guy. I mean, there's
so many others that are. He employs it. Others are kind of more specialist in the nuances of aspects, because he's more of a New Testament scholar than Second Temple Judaism.
N.T. Wright seems like he hasn't been afraid to, and this is why I like. I actually discovered Michael Bird because of a ETS article he had written when he had explored the differences between Piper and Wright, and navigating this third way, and it was. Really convincing to me that anybody who really does take the Bible seriously, which I want to say I think Piper and Reformed folks want to do and try to do, but anybody who's concerned about the context of the first century, writings would want to take seriously the cultural context that was significantly shaping him. So I think N.T. Wright, you're saying, it seems like N.T. Wright he talks a lot about being a historian sometimes, and not just a theologian, but he really is kind of like this broad guy who's doing a biblical theology, and he's not afraid of employing New Perspective. Is that a fair assessment of kind of like what he's doing?
Yeah, so that's he is, there's different ways you can map out New Testament scholarship, but he is more of a kind of a post-conservative is a term that has been applied to him in that sense of still working in those conservative models of the historical method. And so he really does want to ground the Christianity within the historical realia of particularly Second Temple Judaism. He gives a head nod to Greek and Roman issues, but mostly he sees Christianity as a climax of the covenant, right? Climax of Jewish thinking.
Yeah.
Well, he's there in Durham, and James Dunn, who's the other kind of, these are the two twin stars of the New Perspective, are there in Durham. And I never even heard of this place. And then I go start to do a PhD on Paul and like the Vatican, and didn't even know the Catholic Church was there. So funnily enough, 2 years later, I ended up working for N.T. Wright. And this is the other Forrest Gump step here.
Right? Yeah, how'd you get that job? How'd that happen?
So Wright, has written 40 books or something?
I was going to say 400, but if you want to,
however many, right?
I think he writes books over the weekend. That's some.
He can write crazily fast if it's not intensely like tons of footnotes kind of stuff. I mean, it amazes me. But all that's to say is, I go in for this interview because he's looking for a research assistant, and we're going along, and he's like, "Oh, and have you read this book? That relates to this issue?" I was like, "Oh yeah, I've done that." And go along, reads this other one. I was like, "Have you read that?" I was like, "Yeah." Well, those are the only two books that came up in the interview, were the only two books that I'd read of his. So I didn't disabuse him of the idea that I knew his corpus in depth. I barely knew one of the books. Even a friend of mine had just given me. It was a book on tape, a CD of.
That's so funny.
If he had not given me that CD, I probably wouldn't have this job, or gotten that opportunity. So I didn't know much about Wright's theology or approach really when I got hired with him. But I, highly impacting. And I think that one of the things that carries over is like the dispensational theology of reading the Bible closely. Like they're very, I really am grateful for that intense, reading, a close reading of the text, but I never could get a good sense of the narrative. Like, why do you have all these different turns with these different dispensations? Why is God doing all that different stuff?
Yeah.
And it just never made sense. And of course, progressive dispensationalists are better with that, but it's still, I just had this kind of gap there in mind. And like when I engaged Wright, and it fits, he fits so much more closely to patristic ways in some ways, at least that overarching narrative. I think there are other issues that he's quite different, in approach than they would be in that sense. Like he doesn't like allegory and all those kind of things that help undergird that. But
it's funny because his, Surprised by Hope, I think was probably the first book I read of his, where I actually knew who he was, and it was interesting because he obviously was really going after the dispensational pop, but more like the old, the pop culture, folk theology version of, dispensationalism that we, hear a lot of. And it is the hermeneutical lens, right? Like that is the part of dispensationalism for me that's never really, been convincing, I guess. It's like you're saying, well, why do you interpret this text of scripture as part of this dispensation when it doesn't really seem to match the flow? Like the Sermon on the Mount as being my, the one I would say.
Oh, God.
Because the scope, usually the notes are you have to basically say this has no bearing on the church. I mean, it goes as far as to say that. I know, again, progressive dispensationalists, it's like low hanging fruit. None of them believe that, but yeah.
Oh gosh, I had this is one back when I was at DTS. I probably should have known I wasn't cut out or, as centrist to what they were trying to do. I had a professor in Acts 2, or when he was talking about Acts 2. So let me just say the Greek and Hebrew, the New Testament, Old Testament faculty are really, I think, nuanced in their reading of scripture. It's the English Bible people. And so I was in what they call Bible exposition. Yeah. And this guy was trying to argue that when Peter quotes Joel in Acts 2, he's like, now this is like what Joel said. It wasn't a fulfillment of what Joel said because that's not the dispensation we're in. It was like what Joel said. And I was like, I just don't think it's like this. Anyhow, it was one of those things like you're having to just stretch to get there. So
yeah. But I think that's a good point, though, about any of us, because it's funny. The more I did my MDiv, my emphasis was on New Testament theology, but it was heavily biblical studies basis. And then, later on in life, when I went back to grad school and started entering into theology, like I always jokingly say that, theologians like grow up and they do something with the Bible and not, but it's interesting because we do, I think we all do have to be careful not to read things into the scriptures. I know that's super, the eisegesis thing is what everybody always, talks about, but it really is easy to allow the lens that we have to shape the way we read texts. And that's where I think there's probably a lot of, I'm still feel like I'm growing in that way because I do read the Bible through like a quote unquote sacramental charismatic lens. But I also think that maybe because I still have a value for the historical grammatical method of interpretation, like I want to give that primary place, but then I also don't have a problem with Lectio Divina. Like I think that there's a way to read the text and have it speak to us today that both honors the original intention of the author and then the audience, but also can open up the space for the Holy Spirit to speak to us today. Which I'm not sure about the consistency of when and how. Like I'm still that part out, but I do feel like that's probably keep me somewhat grounded. On not being totally crazy.
Yeah, no, and I think there's some balance there. I mean, it's hard for me to go fully back to patristic model with the four senses and all that kind of stuff. But there is. I think the historical grammatical method is limited. If for no other reason, why would God let us get 1,800 years of church history before somebody figured that out, or even
exactly,
or even 1,500 years if you think Luther was doing that? And I'm not sure he was quite doing the exact same thing that modern exegetes are trying to do. And the whole deal is like I think when we came up with Trinitarian theology in 325 with kind of that patristic model of exegesis, I don't think we missed the mark on who God is or what salvation is about. So if it was good enough for them, I think it's probably, and in a lot of ways, this is why I resonate a little bit more strongly with Richard Hayes' hermeneutic than N.T. Wright's, but they're not wildly different, but both use narrative, but Hayes comes from that whole reading backwards approach. I think Hayes exposits, assumes that we're not just historically grounding this and building our way forward. It's like, no, we have received revelation of who God is. And so that it's through that lens that we understand the nature of this story. And I think that actually is, I think Hans Boersma and others would say, that's a more sacramental way of reading scripture than just a historically, a poor way of saying this would be that it's built on a foundationalist epistemology and all that kind of stuff. I don't know that all of that is, but the historic model, you can overstate those things. But I think Hayes's model is a little bit more holistic, and in the sense of reading scripture as it's not just the human author, but really we're engaging the divine author. And so there is some sense of coherence between, say, Lamentations and Paul, even though they're two very distinct human authors.
Yeah, I think it only seems, reasonable to recognize the genre differences and also, the way that God speaks through. But it's interesting though, because I do find it fascinating that were Paul to go to a Baptist Bible college, he might fail their hermeneutic class.
Yeah.
In the same way that Jesus would probably fail a lot of the expository sermon classes, homiletic courses out there, because he doesn't do, his sermons aren't as strict exegetical expository sermons, So
it hit me because I always agreed with that. And so as I was teaching students, you got to have one passage, let that be your focus. And then it struck me, it's like, where have I ever seen Paul do that? Where does Paul just limit himself to one text?
I know.
Bring together the whole narrative, and he'll have like 2 Corinthians 3. He'll have like the golden calf episode as his lens, but then he's got the new covenant text and he's got these other things. And so it's much more holistic rather than just a single text, that you're only expositing.
What's interesting too, though, with that, I can't take any credit for this, but there's I think it's a great book called Inspired Preaching by these two Baptist dudes from down in Texas, actually. I think they're at Criswell.
Okay.
college, but it's basically all the sermons in the Bible in the New Testament, essentially. And when I read it, it's your standard Baptist type of book and whatnot. But one thing that I thought was fascinating about it is that it's interesting that when we think about homiletics or preaching, we oftentimes in our circles we go to Jesus or we go to Paul. And I think when I was going through that, reading that book, it dawned on me that we actually should go to Acts. Acts actually has, there's full on sermons, and so I think it's really insufficient to like look at Galatians as a sermon because it's an epistle. It's more like what you write a theology piece, and that's what Paul was doing. And Jesus obviously is a good example too. But I mean, you have full on. I think of Acts 7, right before he's stoned, he preaches this amazing sermon, and it's the entire biblical theology, the history of Israel, being all in, and then drops the mic and is killed. So, but I think that's also a fascinating thing about homiletics is that you see a lot of different styles, I guess maybe would be one way to put it, or a lot of different ways of doing it. And so I think you're right. It's kind of hard to like go to one clear way to do it, which is why I think I was fortunate enough to be initially trained in homiletics in a Pentecostal environment. So it was kind of like, you can do whatever you want, whatever the Holy Spirit teaches you. So it was like expository, textual, topical, and I think I've been trying to, I don't think this is unique, but I do think that there could be something to be said about it. Because when I think about my I don't know, like calling or vibe or whatever, or my passion, I'm really trying to be pastor theologian. I want to have I don't want to do pastoral preaching, but I also want to be theological. And so it's a little bit different than just doing your typical expository sermon, because I think I'm basing it on a text. I did get that. That's the expositoriness of me, but I want to flesh it out theologically and talk about the implications of the theology that we're reading in that passage of scripture and the questions that are being raised, and I'm still trying to figure that out because it's not like I've been preaching, for 40 years. But I definitely love the theological reflection aspect of the homiletic engagement.
Yeah, I think that's important. It's, I preach about once a month, so I'm definitely not refined or honed in that. And I lend, I come out of that tradition where I do preach one text, so that's my primary. But I think when we make that the only mode, it's like when you pick one atonement model, is like, if this is not it, then everything else is wrong. It's like, no, I think there's a great variety here. And so appreciating God's work through various means, I think is helpful.
Absolutely. And story. I mean, my thing now is just seeing the power of narrative story, and not just in because globally, like when I've gone to other countries, it seems like the power of narrative is so obvious, in storytelling cultures, but in a post-modernity, post-Christian, just in the world we live in, I mean, our social media, right? Instagram stories, Facebook stories, everything is about now trying to tell a story. Marketing is all about storying, and there's something about doing that in a way that's able to spring off of a text to help people understand that text, but also into the story of God. And that's your book, right? I mean, there's a central story that you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's theology in context is basically what we're doing, grounded and out of the Bible, but in the context of history. I mean, one of the things that we haven't really brought up here is just how historically situated we set theology. So we always give a biography of some theologian or someone, so could be more contemporary, like William Seymour, when we talk about the Holy Spirit, or somebody like Augustine, or Aquinas. Some of the, I had better, zoom in on all the icons behind you,
Yeah. Hey, just really quick, the guy who drew all these, except for let's see, this one right here, Mary. All the other ones were written by this guy named John, and he is an artist, and I'm going to have him on the podcast. But yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. Like, I got Karl Barth over here.
Yeah. Okay.
Aquinas, Moses the Black is right there, and all these different theologians.
No, they're great. And I think that's the whole thing is like theology is a conversation of the church. So it's not just the contemporary church. Of course, it's the church over the past 2,000 years. And so just trying to give some flavor of that, who are the people behind this, so not just patristic folks, but Mother Teresa, it's not a common one you would think about eschatology, but so much of like what I say about eschatology is it's way more about ethics in the New Testament.
Yeah.
That's the way you live rather than setting dates and who's the Antichrist and all that kind of stuff. And so
just that chapter, and I was cracking up. I was actually on a plane and I was rereading it and I was cracking up about how you start with Mother Teresa.
Yeah, no, it's not a common one, but I think it is people that are willing to sacrifice and give up something here and now because of their hope for the future. They're the most eschatological people I know, and so that
and I think that's really for anybody who doesn't have this, get engaged in theology just for that, because I walked away from reading that chapter, and I was really impacted by it because I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between ethics and eschatology, because I told you I'm supposed to write this paper for the Catholic Evangelical Dialogue about the relationship between ethics and eschatology. And I think that I've been brainstorming how it seems like a lot of folks who are really into the eschatology world, and I'm going to pick on dispensationalism right now. Forgive me, all you Dallas Theological Seminary students, but classic dispensationalism, the folks who probably weren't listening well, but what they got was don't go to college, don't worry about anything. Everything's about to end, like back in the 70s, and during the Jesus People revivals. Jesus is just about to come back. Don't take care of the earth. It doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. And there was I guess there was ethics, but it was only in relation to evangelism. Like that's the whole thing. But when I read your chapter, I was like, man, it really does open up a lot of other questions about the way we should live our lives now. Because if we do have the hope for the new creation and God reconciling all things to himself and ultimate goals of redemption, then it does really beckon us to do something differently and to live our lives in a specific way, not just about getting people to raise their hand and come forward at a church service to get saved. It's a lot more than that. So get this book, folks.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I think it feels to me like the book crescendos over time. Like once you see creation and then the work of Christ as the Messiah and the Spirit who brings in the kingdom, like it all grows. And I think that eschatology chapter is where it seems to me in my mind, where it kind of locks in and you like see the big picture from creation to new creation.
Great. And for any of our listeners or viewers, I'm going to have links in the description to all of Ben's books. He has obviously your dissertation was published, and I know that's available with Erdman's. This book, you've done other work too. What are you doing? What are you working on right now? What's the next?
Yeah, so God willing, we'll finish in the next few months a book on justification and resurrection. And basically, sometimes what I'm critiquing, and there's various models, but the average one that people know is that justification is a status that happened in the past, and then sanctification is this transformation, and then glorification happens in the future. So past, present, future kind of model. That when Paul talks about justification, it's not so much about a status or just forgiveness, but actually when he quotes Habakkuk 2:4, that the righteous by faith will live. It's this hope, this promise that we're made alive in the process of justification. And so it's not that it's, you're earning your salvation, you're doing these things to be justified, but it's justification actually leads into the life of discipleship. And it's not just like your ticket that gives you your fire insurance to go to heaven someday.
Yeah.
And so really playing out how justification in life in Paul's letters plays out there. And so, doing that and more kind of biblical studies track there.
Awesome. Yeah, great. And then I know, so you're active on Twitter. You're out there posting.
Yeah. It's probably the best way to bump up against me actively. Yep.
Yeah, because you're going to start a YouTube channel eventually, but I just got to keep encouraging you. You also have a website. What do you do on your website?
Yeah, it languishes, but Dunelm is the Latin word for Durham. You're always looking for some twist or angle, and that's where Durham is where I studied, did my PhD. So random thoughts, some patristic, some other things. It languishes though for lack of attention, but random things come up.
21, you are gonna maybe write more, maybe. Possibly.
Yeah, that's my goal. Now that I'm kind of back from sabbatical, got a little bit extra juice in the batteries. So
yeah, that's great. That was one of my quote unquote resolutions for 21. I was like, I want to get back to blogging because I haven't done it for about 4.5 years on a consistent basis.
That's right. Well, all the cool kids are podcasting, so that means the retro stuff. It's like blogging is like the MySpace of
I'm trying to do it all now. I'm going to bring it all back. But hey, one thing that I know that is a potential opportunity for people out there who are interested in studying theology, but are like, there's no way I can go to seminary. I'm not going to move to Houston. I'm not even sure if I can understand things. For someone like that, I hear rumor that there's a way for them to be able to study with you, and I'd love to maybe have you talk about that. What's that entail to look like? And there's a website link right here for people to go to. Tell us about it.
Yeah, that's right. It's this Zoom course that we're doing. So just to make the Bible and theology more accessible to people that are not in seminary. So as a first step there, and it's the big ideas of Scripture and the big story of Scripture and the big ideas of theology. So in that sense, we're putting the Scripture, the narrative of Scripture in that one coherent whole, but then also showing how theology is an extension of that and builds upon it. So it's designed for people that want to take that next steep step. So that's the go deeper, right? But you don't want to get lost in some seminary class where, they're throwing out hypostatic union and all these other terms that you don't have any clue what they're about or why they even matter, So, of course, I'm teaching it. So this Engaging Theology book is one of the core elements that we'll use there. So if you're intrigued and you want to hear me, in person describe kind of the things there along with the book, it's the hbu.edu and then HTS for Houston Theological Seminary, go deeper. So
awesome. Yeah. And again, there's links for all the listening and viewing. There's links in the description, so you can check that out too. Well, Ben, it's an honor and a privilege to spend time talking with you. I know I'm going to have you on again if you would be willing to, because I always love our conversations, and we weren't able to tap into. I want to talk about the topic of your dissertation in a future episode, because your dissertation obviously has a lot of bearing on our current, discipleship, spirituality in general, and I think would really fit within the Sacramental Charismatic wheelhouse. So that'd be awesome to have you on. But
good stuff.
Is there anything you'd want to say to our listeners and viewers as you can take us home?
Yeah, just look forward to more Sacramental Charismatic stuff. I mean, I don't know that I've not cornered the market on this topic by any means. I'm more of somebody stumbling along in that journey. And so just appreciate all your work that you're doing here and your various interviews and, a lot of the stuff that you and Jeff talked about last semester or last year, whenever. Sorry, I talk in academic semester terms, but your last season, found just really stirs the pot for me and helps me think a lot better about what, general ideas that haven't all the way formed myself. So appreciate it.
That's great. Well, we really appreciate your time. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody, for listening. You can find me on social media. I'm hanging out on Twitter, too, at Luke Garrity. And then I also have my website, www.lukegarrity.com. If you go there, I'm starting to post everything on there. So that's a good place to go and check these out. But we'll talk to you guys soon.